Some inheritances come wrapped in velvet ribbon, others in silence, suspicion, and the weight of a single missing clause. In the heart of Manhattan, a will becomes a weapon. A son faces the legacy of a man he barely knew, and the quiet bloom of justice threatens to wither before it flowers. Beneath the surface of wealth and decorum, a deeper question waits. What do we really inherit? Money, memory, or the damage left behind? Before we begin, I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from, and what time it is for you right now. Let me know in the comments. Let's begin the story. It was just past 3, and I was sharpening a pencil with the kind of attention that only comes from boredom, when I heard a knock that was too polite for its own good. 3 taps. No insistence, no rhythm. Just enough noise to qualify as an attempt. The shoes came next. Low heels, soft soles. Deliberate, but not confident. Not the kind that announce authority or even salesmanship. These shoes had made appointments with lawyers and librarians, never policemen. She stepped into the front hall like it might retract. A woman in her 30s with hair that hadn't been styled so much as settled, and a handbag that held more worry than lipstick. Her eyes scanned the space the way people do when they're making up their minds. Not about what they see, but about what they might say. I rose. "Miss Vance?" "Yes." She had a voice like carbon paper, pressed down and very clear. I opened the door wider. "You're early, but that's not a problem. We're always ready for quiet shoes and unquiet folders." She stepped inside, and I got the distinct impression she hadn't yet decided whether coming here was brave, foolish, or both. We sat in the office, Wolfe behind his desk like a ship's figurehead that had given up sailing, and Miss Vance in the red chair, her back barely brushing the cushion. She introduced herself as a secretary. Legal documentation specialist was the phrasing, from Cromwell and Drake, a firm Wolfe had encountered before and had labelled, generously, as commercially ambitious and intellectually incurious. She placed the folder on her lap, unopened, as she handed over a printed scan, slightly off-centre but otherwise sharp. It was a draft of Rupert Barrymore's last will and testament, initialed on each page, signature on the final, date stamped. 8 clauses, she said, in this copy. "And the version filed?" Wolfe asked, already scanning. 7. The 8th is missing. Wolfe's eyes stayed on the page. "Describe it." "It allocated a portion of the estate to an individual not mentioned elsewhere." The name was typed, then struck through. The address below it had been blotted, but the clause remained. "Interesting," Wolfe said, in the tone he usually reserves for new cultivars of phalaenopsis. Miss Vance leaned forward. "The signed version that was filed, the one delivered to probate, skips from clause 7 to the closing declaration. The page numbering doesn't match. It was trimmed. I don't know who did it, but I do know Mr. Drake had both versions on his desk yesterday. Mr. Drake," she added, "died this morning." Wolfe didn't move. "How?" "Collapsed in his office. The firm doctor declared it a coronary. No autopsy." She said it plainly, but not coldly. I asked, "How old was he?" 54. No heart issues. No medication. No complaints. "And what was he doing when he dropped?" Her mouth tightened. "Reviewing the Barrymore file. He had told me an hour earlier that something about the 8th clause had been bothering him." "Bothering him how?" Wolfe asked. "He said he might have to amend the filing, that it might not be valid in its current state." Wolfe nodded slowly, like a man hearing an echo in a familiar cave. "You understand," he said. "If the clause was removed after Barrymore signed it, and Drake knew that," "Yes," she said, "then someone might have had reason to silence him." Wolfe closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, they were watchful again. You have not shared this suspicion with anyone else? No, only you. That wasn't just brave. It was a kind of trust Wolfe rarely invited and never abused. There's something else, she said, her fingers tightening slightly on the folder. The 8th clause did name someone. A male name. I saw it before it was struck out, but I couldn't read it clearly. It looked like Elliot or maybe Ellis. The surname started with an R. And the address? I asked. She shook her head. It was handwritten, scribbled. Then someone, Mr. Drake I assume, tried to ink over it. But you could still make out the number 71, and something that began with Har. Could be Harlem. Or Harrington. Wolfe tapped a finger lightly on the arm of his chair. Barrymore was meticulous, he said. To strike a name without deleting the clause suggests he changed his mind. Or someone changed it for him. Miss Vance didn't respond, but something in her posture shifted, not in triumph, but resignation. She wasn't here to prove a point. She was here to confess confusion, and possibly fear. I took the scan and gave it the sort of reading I usually reserve for accounting ledgers and restaurant menus with Russian phrases. The formatting was right, the signature looked authentic, and the 8th clause, despite its defacement, didn't read like a placeholder. It read like a secret. Wolfe had gone quiet, which meant his thoughts were rearranging furniture. I kept my attention on Miss Vance, whose calm was losing a tug-of-war with something more primal. Her eyes didn't rest anywhere long. She sat still, but every inch of her looked ready to leave the room if asked the wrong question. I said, "You didn't come here just to share a curiosity." "No," she admitted. "You think there's more." "I think someone didn't want that clause to survive. And I think Mr. Drake knew it." I looked over at Wolfe. He wasn't blinking. And that's when I knew we'd moved from curiosity to combustion. When Miss Vance departed, folder reclaimed, gratitude muttered, and nerves only slightly tamed. Wolfe didn't speak. I waited 30 seconds. That's usually the moment when silence stops being atmosphere and becomes a game. "Well?" I finally asked. "She's not lying," he said. "No. But that doesn't mean she's right." "Indeed. But she is worried. Not about us." Finished my report. Handwritten, no copies. And slid it under Wolfe's nose with a flourish that Fritz wisely ignored. The lamb ragout was passable. The brandy warmed just enough to avoid reproach. Wolfe read the notes in silence, pausing only once to frown, not at my phrasing, but at a particular paragraph that mentioned the ink-stained address. He set the report aside, dabbed his mouth and said, "Mr. Goodwin." "Yes, sir." "Retrieve the will. The filed version. Bring it here." I blinked. "Now?" "You may wait until morning if you must. But I want that document." This evening, the game became interesting. That was Wolfe's way of saying he'd just folded the napkin and picked up the knife. And when Wolfe gets hungry for facts, you don't keep him waiting. It's not often I get to impersonate a civil servant and enjoy it. But on that particular Tuesday, I had the pleasure of passing myself off as one Harold P. Dunstable, junior probate officer, wearing a borrowed smile and carrying paperwork freshly printed on Wolfe's typewriter, which he treats like a loaded weapon. The name was fictitious, but the tone was bureaucratic enough to stop questions before they started. The receptionist at Cromwell and Drake was a young woman with the kind of composure that only falters under fire or audit. I presented the credentials with the disinterested confidence of a man 10 minutes late and deeply underpaid. "We're conducting a quick procedural sweep of sealed instruments executed in the last 6 months," I told her. "No disruption, I promise. Just a few document confirmations related to internal clause sequencing. Form B18 stuff." Her eyes flicked from the papers to me and back again. I let my smile drop just a degree. "Of course, Mr. Dunstable," she said, and just like that, I was in. Cromwell and Drake had the kind of office decor that says money, not warmth. Glass where walls should be, books no one reads, and the steady hum of a place too expensive to speak freely. The halls were unnaturally quiet, but the silence was layered. Doors were shut but not locked, and from behind a few of them I caught snatches, whispers, not words. The tension wasn't loud, it was precise. Down one corridor, a pair of junior associates were pretending to review a case file, while clearly recapping something that didn't sit well. One of them said, 7, not 8, and the other gave a nervous glance toward the glass before changing the subject to a golf weekend. I moved on without pausing, but I made a note. Miss Vance hadn't been wrong. Something had changed inside those walls, and the people who noticed weren't ready to say it out loud. Yet. The will in question was filed under heavy protocol. I was led, with polite suspicion, to the document review room by a clerk who looked too young to be handling paper worth 20 million. Still, he retrieved the certified copy of Rupert Barrymore's last will and testament with adequate ceremony and a dash of boredom. I flipped through with practiced efficiency. Clauses 1 through 7 were neatly typed and double verified. No clause 8. No blank space, no smudges, no indication that anything had ever existed beyond the standard closing language. I checked the page numbers. They were sequential, but the margins were uneven, like a paragraph had been pulled, but the rest of the layout refused to adjust. Digital backups were no help either. The scan on file matched this version exactly. If the 8th clause had existed here once, it had been erased so thoroughly that even the ghost of the ink had been scrubbed out. But you can always tell when a document has been curated, and this one had been trimmed like a hedge around a secret. Drake's name still hung in the air like dust that hadn't settled. In the corner office with his nameplate half removed, a framed commendation leaned at an angle. A partner I passed in the corridor stopped just short of acknowledging my presence, then moved along. According to the public record, Harold Drake died of sudden cardiac arrest, which is how genteel death certificates sometimes say, don't ask. But I had enough time and the firm's internal news bulletin to pick up the drift. Drake had collapsed at his desk just after lunch. No known conditions, no complaints that morning, no irregularities in his habits, unless you count concern, which he'd apparently expressed about the Barrymore file to more than one colleague in his last 48 hours. It didn't. We're surprised that I wasn't exactly who I claimed to be. They didn't show it. But I found that when people are waiting to collect money, they rarely ask too many questions, especially if they suspect someone else might lose theirs. Constance Barrymore had the sort of poise you don't get from charm school. It came from knowing she would never need a second chance. She wore her grief like a brooch, visible but ornamental. Yes, I was fond of Uncle Rupert, she told me, in a dry, familial way. He had strong views and expensive rugs. When I brought up the existence of alternate drafts, purely hypothetically, her mouth tensed just slightly. Not in surprise, in calculation. There were always versions, she said. Rupert revised things. Not often, but sometimes. He liked precision. 8 clauses, for example? She paused. 7 is a cleaner number, easier for the lawyers. And just like that, I knew she'd seen the other copy. Whether she cared about the content or just the threat of its reappearance, I couldn't yet tell. But she wasn't surprised, and she certainly wasn't worried, which meant she should be. Arthur Styles had the kind of handshake that was neither limp nor firm. It was a calculation in muscle tone. He smiled with his eyebrows more than his mouth, and invited me into the room like a man rehearsed in both charm and chess. Rupert was particular, he said, and brilliant, in a way that required footnotes. I nodded. And generous? To those who didn't bore him, fortunately I rarely did. I broached the topic of document variations. He laughed, a half-ounce too loud. He had many versions of many things, including his own history. I asked whether he'd ever seen a clause mentioning an unknown heir. No, he said easily. And frankly, I can't imagine he'd leave anything ambiguous. Rupert hated shadows. He said it with such polished finality that it almost passed for sincerity. Almost. Daisy Lane answered the door in silk. She had the kind of face that had aged on her own terms, and the tone of voice trained for theatre. Rupert and I were close, she said, in the confidential sense. She offered me tea and didn't wait for a reply before pouring it into a glass that smelled faintly of gin. Her eyes never rested, and her smile hovered somewhere between flirtation and fatigue. I asked about the will. "Oh, I'm sure I was mentioned," she said. Rupert had a soft spot. When I said the word 8, her fingers twitched, barely, on the cup's rim. The smile stayed, but the air in the room shifted. He was fond of revisions, she said lightly, but not of surprises. And yet, I thought, the surprise may have been his. Frederick Ames had the voice of a man who'd yelled orders in a foreign desert, and the wardrobe of someone who no longer needed medals. His handshake was rough, and he smelled like good bourbon and bad patience. "Rupert saved my skin in 1943, he told me. "We traded favors after that." I asked about the will. He shrugged. "Didn't expect much. Rupert never promised me anything. Didn't have to." When I probed about additional versions or unknown names, he scowled. "Lawyers play games. I don't. If there's something missing, ask the suits." His loyalty was real. So was his deflection. But he had the kind of face that kept secrets the way other men kept coin. That night, just as Fritz was bringing in coffee, the phone rang. Wolfe gestured, as he always does, for me to take it. The voice on the other end belonged to a uniformed sergeant I knew, with a tone I didn't. "Daisy Lane," he said. "Dead." I asked how. "Poisoned. Wine. Private gathering. Hosted by Arthur Styles. Called it a celebration. Will reading. Informal." Wolfe listened without comment as I relayed it. "She drank first," the sergeant added. "Others hadn't yet. Someone made sure she got her own bottle." When I hung up, Wolfe still hadn't spoken. "Red wine," I said. He nodded. "Of course, to mask the bitterness." He closed his eyes, and for the first time since the secretary with the 2 quiet shoes, I saw Wolfe begin to lean forward, not in movement, but in mind. It was barely 10 minutes after Fritz had cleared the last of the coffee cups when the doorbell rang with the impatience of officialdom. "Bring a pie." Wolfe didn't rise, naturally, but he did lift an eyebrow, which in his world is tantamount to falling out of his chair. Kramer dropped the envelope on Wolfe's desk. Fingerprints, wineglass tray. Daisy Lane's apartment. "Your boy here made a delivery. Or a drop." Wolfe gave the envelope the same look he reserves for overcooked fish. "You'll need more than fingerprints and a delivery time, Inspector," he said mildly. "Otherwise, you're simply breathing brimstone because it suits your mood." Kramer turned to me. "Sit down, Goodwin. I want a word before I arrest the wrong man." I took the chair like a man prepared to enjoy it. Kramer took the one across from me and sat like he expected the cushion to explode. Wolfe remained in his own seat, motionless and round as law itself. "You were seen entering Miss Lane's apartment 24 hours before she dropped dead," Kramer said. "Correct. You carried a document. Also correct. You touched the wine glasses." Indirectly, I placed the tray on her side table while she sorted her mail. I did not pour, sip, sample, or poison. He snorted. "How thoughtful. I'm nothing if not civilized." Wolfe leaned back. "Inspector, even if Mr. Goodwin had coated the stemware with arsenic and goodwill, you'd need motive, opportunity, and a mind less cluttered by procedural bravado." Kramer's color darkened. "Which on him looks like storm warnings." "You think you're clever," he muttered. Wolfe said, "No, sir. I know I am. Whether you are remains an open question." I offered Kramer a coffee. He declined. He was already bitter enough. Kramer opened his mouth again, no doubt to accuse, imply, or demand. But Wolfe raised a hand. Not with drama, just with finality. "Inspector," he said, "your theory, such as it is, has the weight of a balloon in a vacuum. You have fingerprints, which prove that Mr. Goodwin has fingers. You have a wine glass, which proves Miss Lane enjoyed vintage beverages. And you have a dead woman, which proves only that life continues its great attrition. Kramer shifted in his chair like he'd been hit with a Latin quotation, but couldn't find the translation. "May I remind you," Wolfe continued, "that you are here without a warrant, without a charge, and without even a competent hypothesis. I would ask that you vacate my office before you embarrass yourself further." I didn't laugh, but I thought about it. Kramer stood slowly, exhaling through his nose. "You'll both hear from me. I look forward to it," Wolfe replied. And just like that, the balloon deflated. Once Kramer had gone, door closed, threshold insulted, I took it upon myself to follow Daisy's trail through her final 48 hours. It wasn't long, but it was complicated. I started with the corner grocer. She'd bought red wine, a soft cheese, and fresh flowers. Normal, but deliberate. From there I hit a dry cleaner who remembered her dropping off a dress she never picked up, and a bodega where she'd argued about the price of imported olives. Proof, if any was needed, that she'd expected to be alive long enough to make the comparison. The last stop was the most telling. A local actress, known for her impersonations and her martinis, told me Daisy had mentioned an important dinner. No names, just that it was private and would settle a few things. She seemed nervous, the actress said, like she'd been handed a role she wasn't sure she wanted. That made sense. If Daisy had been sitting on knowledge about Clause 8 and using it for leverage, then someone might have decided she didn't belong in the final cast. By late afternoon, Wolfe had summoned Saul Panzer, which is like summoning a scalpel. No frills, no chatter, just precision. Saul returned the next morning with a single sheet of hotel stationery, pulled from the trash at Daisy's place. It was folded once, half torn, but the scrawl was still legible. "Meet me after. Don't tell Mr. F." I handed it to Wolfe. He took it, then faces. Recalled hearing an argument 2 nights prior. Daisy and a man. She said repeatedly, "I have the letter." Saul pressed for details. She said, "It proves it. The whole thing. It undoes the game." Wolfe's eyes closed, not in weariness but in thought. She didn't say, "changes the game," he murmured. She said, "undoes." Stronger. Final. She thought it would blow everything open, I added. And now it's gone, Wolfe said. As is she. I said nothing. We both knew that in our line of work, the most dangerous thing a person can possess is a truth no one else wants read. That evening, while Fritz prepared veal with rosemary, I passed the orchid room on my way to file. I paused, hearing Wolfe speaking low. Not to me, but to the orchids. His voice was almost meditative. "The omission is the most elegant betrayal," he said. "To delete is not to deny, but to conceal, without the mess of contradiction." He was clipping a stem with careful fingers. When a man strikes a name from a document, he does not erase the name. He erases the question. The truth remains, but its address has been scratched from the envelope. I didn't interrupt. Wolfe's soliloquies, when they come, are not meant for dialogue, but I took a mental note. We weren't looking for a name anymore. We were looking for a deletion, one so quiet, it hoped never to be spoken again. The next morning I returned to Cromwell and Drake under my own name. The air was tighter. Harold Drake's office had been cleared, and a junior partner now occupied it, with the uncertain dignity of a man sitting in a warm chair. I asked to review the Barrymore case file again. "Procedural query," I said. He hesitated, then gestured toward a law volume lying open on a side table. Some notes were still marked in there, he said. Drake was cross-referencing case law. I opened the book to the flagged page and found what I hadn't expected. An envelope, folded lengthwise, stuffed between pages like a forgotten receipt. It had been slit cleanly. I pulled it out. Inside was a single piece of paper, typed in black ribbon. No signature. Do not let them find him. That was all. Not who, not why, just the imperative. Wolfe was right. The truth had been struck out, but its shadow remained, and someone was willing to kill to keep it buried. When Wolfe says nothing for more than 2 minutes while staring at a piece of paper, you can be sure something in the ink has offended either his logic or his digestion. In this case, it was the former. The scan of the missing clause was on his desk, pristine in its digital imperfection, and Wolfe regarded it the way a jeweler might eye a diamond someone tried to pass off as flawless. The clause, he said, reads, "To my surviving heir, with whom I have spoken privately and whose address I have personally recorded." He looked up. "Do you see it? I saw a dead financier trying to reach beyond the grave to someone who hadn't yet been found." Wolfe continued, "The choice of phrase, 'with whom I have spoken,' is formal, yes, but it reflects intimacy, and in this context, the legal cadence, the use of heir without any qualification, it was not written for ambiguity. You're saying the heir's a man? I am saying that Rupert Barrymore, a man of significant legal precision and unremarkable sentiment, would not have left such a clause for a woman without naming her. The omission is its own signature." That was Wolfe, deducing gender from grammar. I reached for my coat. "Want me to chase that down?" "Yes," he said, "before it grows fainter than the ink." Saul Panzer, in his usual capacity as bloodhound and archivist, returned to the brownstone at noon with a dust-smudged envelope and the restrained triumph of a man who has once again proved himself necessary. "Off-site storage," he said. "Locked cabinet. File box marked R. Barrymore. Drafts. No chain of custody records. No logs." Inside the envelope was a folded piece of firm stationery, yellowed, slightly cracked at the corners, and covered in the unmistakable hand of any official listings of Barrymore's extended family, board members, or former employees. But I've learned over the years that if a name disappears from public record, it usually means it was never there in the first place. I started making calls. A retired bookkeeper from Barrymore's brokerage days recalled a troublesome incident involving a younger woman and a short-lived monthly stipend. Another, even older contact from the auction house circuit remembered Barrymore taking a sudden interest in a jazz venue uptown in the late 40s. Not for the music, but for someone playing it. The talk was quiet, but the pattern had a rhythm. One woman, no marriage, no lawsuit, a son, a quiet transaction, and a lifetime of pretending it hadn't happened. The jazz age had its own rules, and Barrymore had obeyed only the ones that didn't cost him reputation. But a man who hides his sins doesn't always bury them. Sometimes he just folds them into Clause 8 and hopes no one reads the fine print. By the time I got to the doctor, I'd already built the shape of the story. What I needed was confirmation that Barrymore's pulse had caught up with his conscience before his heart stopped altogether. His former valet, now managing a dry little antique stall on Lexington, remembered that Barrymore had become softened in his final year. He began rereading his college letters, the man told me. Talked more about music, less about margins. Once he asked me if I'd ever regretted anything that didn't make it into writing. When I asked what that meant, he shook his head. I think he was deciding something. The doctor, retired, semi-sober, and still loyal to discretion, confirmed that Barrymore had been coming in more often than necessary. He asked about stress levels, inheritance laws. He even asked me what kind of life expectancy an artist might have if he were, and these were his words, just beginning to matter to me now. Which wasn't medical information, but it was diagnosis enough. Saul was the one who connected the R to the piano. Name popped up once, he said, in a grant rejection file. Elliot Rudd, jazz pianist, applied under the name R. Elliot for a residency in Queens. Rejected. No follow-up address, but a club owner in Harlem remembered him. That was good enough for me. I took a cab uptown and paid a cover charge to drink coffee in a room that smelled like nostalgia and faint disappointment. The man at the bar was greying, cynical, and probably had more memory than teeth. "Elliot Rudd?" I asked. "Played here 5 years ago. Classy hands. Temper like a furnace." Said he'd changed his name because his real one didn't pay. "Why'd he stop?" The man shrugged. "Said the piano belonged to someone else now." I gave him a card and a few bills to match. "Is he still around?" The man squinted. "He's not gone. But he's not here either." That was New York for. Look harder. Elliot Rudd's building wasn't hard to find. 5 stories, brick, 3 windows broken and 1 patched with cardboard. I made it up to the 3rd floor without meeting resistance, unless you count the peeling paint and a hallway that smelled like old regret. The door to 3B was ajar. Not open, ajar, which in my experience is worse. I knocked once, then pushed. The apartment was small, cluttered, and recently disturbed. A broken lamp, a half-toppled shelf of music books, and a coffee mug shattered near the sink. No blood, no body, no sound. The piano, a battered upright in the corner, had dust on its keys, and a stool knocked aside like someone had risen in a hurry. There was no note, no sign of where he'd gone, or how. But there was one thing I noticed. The record on the turntable wasn't jazz. It was silence, and someone had left it spinning. By the time I got back to the brownstone, Fritz had already intercepted the delivery. No signature, no return address. Just a handoff from a boy who didn't wait long enough to be questioned. Inside the envelope, a worn leather wallet, cracked at the spine, and a folded piece of paper typed on an old Remington. Single wish for actual velvet to muffle their opinions. But Mr. Clarence DeWitt, sole owner and moral compass of the Staccato Club on Lenox Avenue, dealt exclusively in 2 things: Sunday sermons on sin between sets, and smuggled cigars from Havana. One of which he offered me as if it were a wedding ring. Elliot Rudd, he said, lighting up, was the kind of pianist who made you feel like you were eavesdropping on his heartbreak. Then, with a bitter puff, "Only thing is, heartbreak implies there was once a heart in play." Clarence remembered a man who played like thunder, but spoke like thunder's echo. Low, brief, and only when cornered. He didn't smile, Mr. Goodwin, not even for applause. He just wanted the keys and quiet. "And one more thing," Clarence added, tapping ash into a coffee saucer. He paid his tab in exact change, every time, except the last week. Then, nothing. She opened the door with the kind of grace that only comes from having once believed in poems. Her name was Adela Chase, former lounge singer, current keeper of candles and regrets. The apartment smelled of rosewater and unopened letters. She poured tea but didn't drink it. He hated euphemisms, she said, eyes on the rim of her cup. Said they were lies in pearls. I asked about Elliot. She didn't flinch. He was angry, but not loud angry. The kind that simmers until it's not anger anymore. Just knowledge. He wasn't erased for being born wrong. He was erased for being inconvenient. Her voice dipped, for reminding them of something they'd rather forget. When I asked if she'd seen him recently, she hesitated. Then, "He came by 2 weeks ago. Left a scarf and a question. What would you do if silence had teeth?" I jotted it down. Wolfe has a taste for riddles that bleed. The kid looks barely legal to vote, but old enough to drown in chords. Name was Teddy Mays, a jazz student at Juilliard, who'd spent 3 years trying to play like Elliot Rudd, and maybe 3 minutes actually talking to him. "Mr. Rudd didn't teach," Teddy said, fingers twitching like they missed the piano. He challenged. He'd sit down, play 3 notes and say, "If you need 4, you're not ready." I asked about the last time they spoke, last week. He was different, nervous, wouldn't sit still, kept glancing at the window. Said someone was watching the keys. I thought he meant me, like musically, you know. I nodded, but the kid wasn't done. He handed me a folded sheet of music. Said if I disappear, look at bar 11. Then he left. Didn't even close the door behind him. Bar 11. Music that muttered secrets. Wolfe would love that. The parlour smelled of orchid bark and latent tension. Wolfe, comfortably anchored in his custom chair, had arranged the triumvirate of legal discomfort: Constance Vale, Frederick Styles, and the ever-fussy Charles Frederick, into a triangle facing him. I manned the credenza, looking more useful than I felt. No tea was served. Wolfe said it corrupted discourse. "We are here," Wolfe began, "because truth, like music, requires both silence and the breaking of it." Constance offered a smile like a tailored glove. "I hope this is not an inquisition, Mr. Wolfe." "It is not," he replied. "But if it becomes one, it will be efficient." What followed was an exchange of niceties with the edge of razors. Wolfe needled gently. Clauses, signatures, the sudden absence of an heir from the public eye. Frederick coughed. Styles adjusted his cufflinks, and Constance crossed her legs without shifting her face. On the table, one orchid, pale yellow. Symbol of deceit in Victorian flower language. Wolfe knew his botany, and so did Constance. She looked at it, then looked away. The crack didn't sound like a confession. It was casual, half buried in a sentence about estate logistics. "Well, if Eli," Constance began, then faltered. Her lips twitched, just once. "If Mr. Rudd is to be located..." Arrived. Wolfe reclined and reached for his beer. Fritz had placed it precisely an inch from his elbow. "Suppression," he said, "is an act of cowardice dressed in discretion." I perched on the armrest of the green chair. That sounded almost theological. "It is moral," Wolfe corrected, "not spiritual. Constance Vale is neither fool nor fiend. She is a custodian of rot, tidy and blind. The 8th clause threatens an arrangement built on omissions." I asked, "Think she's dangerous?" Wolfe took a sip. "No, but what she protects, maybe." He didn't elaborate, which was classic Wolfe. Present the spark. Let me walk into the flame. "And the fire?" I asked. He swiveled his gaze to me. "It comes not from what's hidden, but from who decides to hide it." The call came just after 11. Saul Panzer's voice was clipped, even for him. "Apartment, 145th Street, Rudd's. It's on fire." By the time I arrived, the street was a kaleidoscope of orange and panic. Firemen sprayed blackened windows while neighbours watched with folded arms and furrowed brows. No body had been pulled, no statement made. I found Saul near a lamppost, eyes narrowed behind the smoke. "Molotov," he said. "Started in the music room, no doubt. Elliot?" "Gone. No neighbours saw him. Landlord says he hadn't paid rent in 2 weeks. The piano was charcoal. Keys melted to ivory puddles. One cop said they'd found traces of someone having lived there recently, but no blood, no note. Just an empty whiskey glass and a record that ended in a locked groove." Wolfe, when I called, didn't react. "Presumed dead," he said. "Presumptions are opiates." It was nearly 2 when the payphone outside the 10th Street deli rang. I picked it up on instinct. "Goodwin?" There was a pause. Then a voice, hoarse but intact. "They missed." It was Elliot Rudd. "I don't burn easily," he added. "I've got 2nd-degree silence, not 3rd. I asked where he was. I heard a jazz melody in the background. Piano, imperfect, live. "Tomorrow," he said. "Somewhere no one claps." The line went dead. I stood there holding the receiver like it was a relic. The night pressed in close. Elliot Rudd. Eli wasn't ashes. He was a question with smoke on it. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe didn't look up when I entered. "Well?" "He's alive." Wolfe nodded once. "Then so is the clause." And just like that, the embers stirred again. The church basement on 127th Street smelled faintly of must and fried onions, as if last Sunday's potluck still lingered in the air like a hymn no one dared sing. The bulb above my head flickered once, enough to remind me I wasn't here for spiritual renewal. I spotted him in the far corner, behind the folding chairs and a battered upright piano that had likely seen better congregations. Elliot Rudd looked like a man who had missed his own obituary. His eyes, sunken but burning, locked onto mine with the clarity of a grievance that had ripened too long. He stood as I approached, but made no move to shake hands. I offered none. "So," I said, "either you've got a ghostwriter or someone tried to barbecue the wrong man." "Don't be clever, Mr. Goodwin," he replied, his voice like gravel dragged across sheet music. "They meant to burn me. They missed." He leaned in. "I won't be quiet anymore." I didn't smile. Good, because my boss doesn't like silence unless he's ordered it himself. And that was enough to get us both listening. He sat on the edge of the stage and lit a cigarette like it was legal again. Eyes narrowed not from the smoke but from memory. "He came to see me," he said, 14 months before he died. No lawyers, no press, just him, a coat 2 sizes too large and guilt he carried like an extra lung. I stayed quiet. It wasn't just the acoustics of the basement that carried his voice. It was the way he'd been waiting to speak. He didn't deny I was his son. Didn't call it a misunderstanding. He said he'd made a choice. Then he said he wanted to make another. And that choice was? "Wrote unnotarized," I said, "which makes it worth less than Fritz's shopping list in probate court." Elliot nodded. "But it's real. I know his signature. I saw him write it. And he said the others would never accept it, that it would have to come out some other way." "And you decided the best place for it was a drawer?" "No," he said flatly. "My coat pocket. For months I wanted to burn it. Then I couldn't." His voice cracked. I didn't want to believe I'd need it, and suddenly, belief was exactly the currency in play. "Look," I said, folding the copy in half, then in half again. "I'm not here to hug you or sing your praises to the probate angels, but Wolfe doesn't do sentiment. He does arithmetic. And this," I tapped the folded paper, "adds up to a game someone doesn't want played." He didn't flinch, but he looked at me like he wanted to. "He'll protect you. Not because you're innocent. He doesn't believe in those, but because you're interesting. And because you've been erased. He has a soft spot for the invisible, though he'd rather eat tripe than admit it." Elliot laughed without smiling. "You sound like you've practiced this." "I have," I said. "Too many times. With men who had less to lose." He stared down at the paper. "If I give it to you, you won't disappear again. Not under Wolfe's roof." He stood. The handshake this time was dry, but final. And as I walked up the church steps, I knew I had traded my evening for something heavier than words. I was halfway across 116th when Saul's voice cut through the phone like a scalpel wrapped in tweed. "Kramer's on the warpath," he said. "Someone saw you entering the church. He's calling it obstruction." I stopped walking. What kind of obstruction? I haven't even obstructed dinner yet. "There's a warrant. Your name's on it. He thinks you're hiding Elliot." "Well," I muttered, "that's not entirely inaccurate." "I didn't hear that," Saul said. "But you'd better be back at the brownstone before midnight. Wolfe's already moved dinner to 11:30. Lamb. He's furious." "Furious because I might be arrested?" "No," Saul replied. "Furious because the rosemary was too coarse." I hung up and flagged a cab like a man about to plead not guilty on principle. As we turned toward the brownstone, I thought about Kramer, angry, competent, and absolutely intolerant of secrets. And I thought about Wolfe, comfortable, methodical, and entirely dependent on men like me to dance with the law, while he dined with it. Wolfe held the duplicate with 2 fingers, as if it were an orchid with a questionable pedigree. He didn't speak for a long time. Fritz had placed the lamb before him with ceremonial care, and though I saw his lips twitch at the scent, the document took precedence. "This," he finally said, "is either the work of a desperate man, or a man who was promised the truth and found betrayal instead." "It's his handwriting," I said. "The clause is the key." Wolfe nodded. If Elliot Rudd had appeared at the reading, the inheritance entirely would have passed to him. Sole heir, no division, no ambiguity. "Clause 8, I said, "the hidden gear in the grandfather clock." He folded the document and set it beside his wineglass. He was meant not to appear. That much is evident. I didn't ask how he knew. Wolfe doesn't guess. He decants. And as the clock struck midnight, I realized something beneath the varnish of civility was starting to hum, just faintly. I leaned back in the red chair, thinking about the wording. "If Elliot Rudd appears in person at the reading," I murmured, "the estate shall pass to him in full, superseding prior named beneficiaries." Wolfe's eyes glinted. Precisely. It was conditional. A trap disguised as inheritance. "You think the others knew?" He didn't answer directly. Wolfe rarely trying to reschedule an eclipse. His instruction was characteristically terse. "Invite them. Here, Wednesday, 8. He didn't say, "or else." He never does. But the "or else" hangs there, plump and implied. So I did my rounds. Elliot Rudd, to his credit, showed up looking more composed than a man presumed dead has any right to. Frederick Ames arrived with a face like an unpaid invoice, clenched and reluctant. Styles managed to ooze in with the same casual insolence he brings to every chair he occupies. Constance, cool as glacial melt, gave Fritz the kind of nod that suggested she'd taken larger risks for smaller causes. And then Kramer, barrel-bodied, cigar already chewed into submission, came grumbling like a summoned volcano. I knew what Wolfe was planning. I also knew that none of them, not even the inspector, would dare miss it. At 8 sharp, Wolfe cleared his throat and announced, "You are all here. The time has come to compare truths and fictions." He gestured toward the thick envelopes resting on the desk. "What you see before you are 2 documents," he said. "Each purports to represent the last testament of Harold Drake. But only one is valid, and both are revealing." The silence that followed wasn't polite. It was defensive. Every eye flicked to the paper like it might detonate. And Wolfe, looking deeply pleased with himself, and not even pretending to hide it, nodded once to me. "Mr. Goodwin, the chairs, if you would." The seating arrangement was not democratic. Fritz had already set the chairs with his customary precision, and I made sure each backside found its designated location. Wolfe believes that control of a room begins with the chairs, and the people who resent where they're placed. Elliot got the wingback, closest to Wolfe's desk. Styles and Ames were side by side, a pairing they deserved. Constance was stationed directly opposite Wolfe, her back to the fireplace. And Kramer, by necessity, got the floater. No symbolic location, just volume control. Wolfe leaned back slightly and pressed the tips of his fingers together. "Let us begin with the will you all already know," he said. 7 clauses, each generous in its own bitter way. Equal division, carefully worded philanthropy, and most crucially, the absence of one Elliot Rudd. No one flinched. Not yet. He held up the second will. This one, slimmer, but heavier by implication. This version includes an 8th clause, a condition, a name, and a test of conscience that someone in this room ensured would fail. "You're calling it authentic?" Kramer barked. "I'm calling it revealing," Wolfe replied. "And if you let me proceed, I may call it criminal." Elliot remained expressionless, but I caught the twitch in Ames's hand. Constance's jaw stiffened a notch, and Styles uncrossed and recrossed his legs with theatrical indifference. "Mr. Goodwin," Wolfe said, "fetch the relevant page." I opened the folder and handed him the sheets. Wolfe didn't like to read standing, or ever, but when he read aloud, the words took on something that didn't belong to ink. He began with the first will. Then, with measured care, he lifted the other and said, "Now, Clause 8. And the room stopped breathing. Wolfe read the clause like a judge preparing a noose. Clause 8. Should the individual known as Elliot Rudd, natural son of the testator, present himself at the reading of this testament within 10 days of the testator's death, the full estate shall pass to him alone. Failing such appearance, distribution shall proceed according to clauses 1 through 7. He placed the page gently on the table. "Elegant," Wolfe murmured, "and savage." A perfect blade hidden in velvet. Kramer shifted in his chair. "You trying to tell me this is legitimate?" Wolfe tilted his head. "It was mailed to Mr. Rudd. It bears Harold Drake's handwriting. Though not notarized, its contents are consistent with the man's documented regrets and ambitions." "And if he didn't show up?" I asked, though I already knew. "Then the heirs win. All of them. Neatly. Permanently." Elliot spoke for the first time. He told me he wanted to make things right, precisely when it was most inconvenient. He gestured toward the timeline I'd taped neatly to the far wall, another touch he'd requested, then dismissed as unnecessary once completed. In the final months of his life, Mr. Drake made private contact with his son. Not through legal channels, not even through correspondence visible to the estate. He reached out, met him, argued with him, then in a moment of clarity or guilt, amended his wishes. "How do you know?" Styles interjected. Wolfe arched a brow, because the draft was typed by Harold Drake's private secretary. A man named Harold Drake Kramer let out a snort. "Cute. But not untrue," Wolfe said. "Harold typed his own letters. Always. And only one other person would have seen the clause before it was delivered." He turned slightly. Harold Drake attempted to withdraw from a conspiracy of silence. He recognized the injustice. He amended his will and told at least one accomplice, who in turn silenced him. Ames muttered, "That's conjecture." "No, Mr. Ames. That's logic. Conjecture is what you built your story on." The room was tightening. Elliot had not moved, but his gaze had sharpened. "Someone," Wolfe said, "intended this inheritance to pass without interruption." And someone else began to interrupt. Wolfe steepled his fingers. "Miss Lane," he said, "was many things. Vain, opportunistic, ambitious, but not stupid." That earned a reaction. Styles flinched. She recognized the silence surrounding Elliot Rudd. And when silence is too consistent, too orchestrated, it becomes a map. I glanced at Kramer. He looked like he wanted to interrupt, but wasn't ready to risk it. Daisy discovered Elliot's identity. Wolfe continued. She confronted Constance, then Frederick. She even contacted Elliot, once from a payphone, though she left no name. And then she wound up dead, Kramer muttered. Indeed. But not. Wolfe leaned back. She played her final hand. Someone else reshuffled the deck. Now we come, Wolfe said softly. To fire. He gestured to a photocopy of the note Elliot had received. I had obtained a handwriting sample from a cancelled cheque in Ames's desk drawer. A little sleight of hand Wolfe didn't ask for, but tacitly approved of. Compare the loops, Wolfe instructed. The F's in forget. The upward strike on the E in Elliot. The handwriting is the same. The note was penned by Mr. Frederick Ames. That proves nothing, Ames snapped. I was warning him. Ah, Wolfe said. How civic-minded. And then the Molotov cocktail. Was that your interpretation of a fire drill? Kramer growled. You'd better shut up, Ames. Wolfe continued. The goal was not just to frighten. It was to erase, permanently and conveniently. The apartment had no body, but the assumption served you well, didn't it? Elliot looked down, his voice low. They thought they got me. Yes, Wolfe said. But you survived. And now they do not. It was not Wolfe's style to shout. When he aimed to destroy, he did it with a lowered voice and an elevated verb. The question remains, he said. Who orchestrated the symphony of doubt? He looked not at the guilty, but at the composed. Constance Drake did not blink. You convinced them, Wolfe said. One by one. That Elliot would never show, that Harold's shame was buried, that risk lay only in recognition. Constance's mouth twitched. That's absurd. No, that is you, the custodian of legacy, the daughter who rewrote lineage with silken diplomacy. Elliot stood, but Wolfe raised a hand. She didn't kill. She didn't forge. She merely suggested, whispered, persuaded. She provided the philosophy. Why? Elliot asked. Constance answered flatly. Because your existence broke everything he built. And yet, Wolfe murmured, you came tonight. Why? She looked at Elliot. Because I was wrong. Kramer made the arrests. It wasn't tidy, but it was effective. Ames didn't resist. Styles folded. Elliot Rudd didn't ask for a pen. He brought his own. It was a slim black Mont Blanc, and he uncapped it with the same quiet resolve a man might reserve for signing a ceasefire after a personal war. The paperwork lay on Wolfe's desk like a flattened contradiction, wealth unclaimed by the man who could claim it all. He signed quickly. No fanfare, no speech, no flair for the dramatic. Just his name, neat and curved, on the line that would transfer 80% of his inheritance to a Harlem music foundation bearing his father's name. It was, he said, the only inheritance that mattered. Wolfe, who had managed to remain uncharacteristically silent through it, gave a single nod, not approval, not disapproval, but something that belonged to a third category entirely, perhaps respect. Elliot folded the remaining documents and tucked them under his arm. I prefer music that doesn't play too loud, he murmured. That, Wolfe replied, is wisdom earned, not inherited. I walked him to the door. The quiet he left behind wasn't awkward. It was dignified. Wolfe didn't linger in the office, with a muttered invocation about work having concluded and dignity being best observed in silence. He retreated to the orchids. I've seen him leave triumphs like lesser men leave defeats, without spectacle. But there was something in the deliberate slowness of his steps that told me the machinery inside his head had not stopped turning. He had solved the case, yes, but he hadn't rebalanced the world, just the facts. From the hallway, I watched him vanish into the warm, humid sanctum he loves more than most people. The orchid room door closed with the soft finality of a courtroom gavel. There would be no applause. Wolfe didn't need it, or maybe he did. and had simply taught himself to live without it. I stayed in the office a moment longer, waiting for the silence to tell me something it never quite managed to say. If you'd asked me 3 days ago how Elliot Rudd would play it, I'd have wagered a decent necktie on retribution. A press conference, maybe. A lawyer with teeth and teethers. But Elliot surprised me, which in itself is a rare and valuable currency in this line of work. He had the right to every cent, legally, morally, even poetically. But instead of cashing in on the full weight of that clause, he decided to rewrite the story the old man never finished telling, using a pen, not a scalpel. I'll admit it unnerved me a little. Most people don't let go when they finally get the leverage. They pull, hard. But Elliot, he released it. Not to forgive, not exactly, but to step outside the loop of vengeance and simply end it. There's a kind of courage in that. Not the loud kind, the kind that doesn't need an audience. He didn't reclaim the money. He reclaimed his name. In Wolfe's world, that would count as a tidy conclusion. But in mine, it left just enough unease to make me keep the lights on a little longer than usual. Kramer arrived at the brownstone with his coat half-buttoned and his mood fully ruined. That was my first clue. The second was the cigar. Unlit, chewed flat on one end like it had lost an argument. He stood in the foyer like a man trying to decide whether to curse or compliment, and resented the choice either way. I led him into the office without commentary. Wolfe looked up, registered the intrusion, and offered a single word. "Inspector." "I ain't here to congratulate you," Kramer began, which in the local dialect of homicide meant thank you. Wolfe grunted. "Nor to apologize, I presume." "Hell no." Kramer jammed the cigar back between his teeth. "But you were right. Damn it." He turned to me. "Tell your boss I said thanks." "I heard," Wolfe said. Kramer grunted again, spun on his heel, and exited before the compliment went septic. I followed to lock the door. Wolfe was already reaching for his beer. "I presume that counts as gratitude," he said. "Close enough," I replied. Didn't need to. The rosemary lingered, but so did the justice. By the time dessert was cleared, apple galette, not that you asked, I'd already stacked the paperwork, closed the file, and labelled it in Wolfe's cabinet under R for Rudd, E for Elliot, and C for consequences. The 8th clause had been a ghost for months. Now it was real, real enough to topple fortunes, end friendships, and make enemies out of strangers who thought they were family. One paragraph had taken down 2 lives, Daisy Lane, whose reach exceeded her calculation, and Harold Drake, who flinched when it mattered most. But more than that, the clause had made survivors into suspects, and suspects into reluctant mirrors. Frederick Ames saw himself as a rightful heir. Constance believed she was securing what she'd earned. And Elliot, well, Elliot had seen himself as erased. In the end, it didn't redistribute wealth. It redistributed identity. I filed it away and turned off the lamp, but I didn't lock the drawer. Some things belong in archives, others in memory. Wolfe was back in the orchid room. I found him there, scissors in hand, trimming away a dead bloom like a scholar editing a forgotten essay. "You're late," he said, not turning. "Dinner, dessert, and a war over rosemary." I earned a pause. He nodded faintly. "Do you know what footnotes are, Archie? Annotations for people who want to argue with the author, or acknowledgements of what was omitted," he said. He snipped. "The truth is not what we find, but what we're willing to read, even in the footnotes." I didn't reply. He was in that mood, the one where he stopped talking to me and started talking to whatever ghost was convenient. Barrymore's ghost, maybe. Or his own. The bloom dropped soundlessly to the floor. Wolfe reached for another. Outside, the city moved as it always did. Too fast, too loud, too forgetful. But inside the brownstone, there was only breath, thought, and the quiet rearrangement of what had once gone unnoticed. Some truths you find in bold ink. Others whisper from the margins. In the end, it wasn't the clause that held the power. It was the silence it created, and the men and women who tried